Good morning, everyone. So today we are going to start with just kind of recapping what we've reviewed so far about the reading test, and get into more of the grammar review and details about like the writing and language test and the math test going forward. Okay, so everyone should be ready to go, and everyone should know what your homework had been. So your homework that is due for today was practice test 1, as well as watching the math videos provided by Mr. Anthony. You also needed to self-score your practice test for today so that you can ask me questions if you have anything wrong. Also due today was the recommended reading from chapters 1 to 4, which are about the first 2 chapters, kind of recap about just the SAT in general in terms of registration and scoring and just the content and breakdown of the exam. So it's relatively important information for you to know for your preparation, because it provides background information about the test and context for you for moving forward and being registered for the exam, and just kind of getting you situated so that you are acclimated enough to be able to focus on the practice that you need to do for your test. Okay. So also due today would be some work on the memrise.com. I didn't receive contact or information from students through email, which is what I needed to set you up on our memrise.com account to do the vocabulary if you were interested. So if you are interested in doing the vocabulary, please email me so that I can add you or I can give you step-by-step instructions for accessing that. Okay, so without further ado, we're kind of going to refocus for what we're going to be doing today. So today is week 3. So we are going to be focusing on reviewing practice test 1, which was your homework for today. And then, as I said, we're going to be kind of moving forward. So if there's anything that we've covered that you don't understand, please ask me. Or please say, stop, I don't understand. And if there's enough of you, I will be able to take a second and try to address your question. Otherwise, please just email me if we don't go into enough depth over a particular topic that you're struggling with. And I won't know if you're struggling unless you tell me. So please tell me. Okay. All right. So that all kind of being said, as you can kind of see, just this is our homework, and I will send it to you later today. So your homework is going to be practice test 10. Time permitting today, we're going to start some sections of that, or at least look at a few problems if we can, but I think practice test 1 will probably take most of the class. Also, depending on how many questions everyone has. You will have some reading for this week. And again, as I've said before, so someone did actually just ask a quick question, because if you have to leave early, the videos will be sent out with 4 of the class will be sent out to you every week through an email. They'll be included with the homework email, but they'll also be posted on our YouTube channel for Embrace Tutoring. So you can find it there if you don't receive it, or just email me and I can make sure you receive it. This session actually will be posted on YouTube probably within the next 24 hours or so. I'm not entirely sure. I don't actually do that portion. Embrace does that. So they will let you know, but it's usually when they send out the homework email. So once you get your homework email, you can go and access the classroom and find out what you would be missing. Okay, so that's a good question. And just to kind of reiterate to everyone, because I know we had a lot of people who came in late last week, we can't really stay extra. So we can't stay beyond class. That's part of the reason you're provided with an online copy of the video. so that you can use it to refer to anything that you missed. Okay. And if, as always, if you have any questions, please email me, and I can go through them with you. Okay. Um, anyway, so back to the reading for this week for homework, which again will be sent out when I send out the homework email, or when the homework email gets sent out, and that you will have access to those chapters, although you should have access from the document I shared with you last week, from the notes document. But it would be for chapters 5 to 6, and also chapters 10 and 15. So you have chapter 5 and 6, 10 and 15. So 10 and 15 would basically be the about chapters. You have an about for the math section, an about chapter for the writing and language, and then you have chapter 6 should be the beginning of the writing and language, the writing and language test. I'm sorry. So there was a distracting noise in the in the background here, and it can happen periodically. So chapters 5 to 6, chapters 10 and chapter 15 this week will be your reading. Okay, so chapter 5 will really kind of give you a better idea of the just general content, the first kind of glimpse into really the reading test and the SAT test makers kind of breakdown of what the test is about for those particular sections. So it's their take on it, not necessarily the reality of what it is that you have to do. So it's more from a teaching standpoint than it is from a student standpoint, in my opinion. But it is still important for you to read and understand. So anyway, kind of getting started, I do want us to just dive in here with our questions about practice test 1. So let's first just take a quick look at practice test 1, and then we can kind of go to my annotations. Okay, so everyone should see on their screen the reading test. How did this passage go for everyone? Did anyone struggle with this one in particular? This entire, in terms of its general test, the full test, rather than particular sections at this point. We'll get into particular sections in a few minutes when we kind of look at the annotations. But did anyone find that this particular test was harder than one that they've done before, like practice test 8? Please let me know in the chat or in the Q&A when you have a second, so that I can kind of just get some feedback about where everyone is with their practice so far. Okay, so people found it okay. Some people found it easier than previous tests. Anyone find it really hard? No? So no one, second passage, you got a lot wrong? Okay. So some of the passages were trickier than others. That's true. So a lot of people found it was pretty good. That's good. Are you kind of getting a little bit used to the types of questions you see on the exam now that you've taken at least 2 practice tests? And for those of you who found this particularly challenging, that's okay too, because every test is different. And some tests are going to be easier for certain people, some are not. Some might have content that is easier for you than for other students. Yeah. So someone made a comment that this particular test was a little bit similar to the AP Comp and Lit questions, but a little bit easier. It is in the same kind of vein, although it's not to the extent that those content questions are. There are two different purposes for those two exams. AP comp, lit and comp is more content oriented, whereas this is more testing how you take the test. That isn't to say that there aren't strategies on this test that you could use on the AP exam. But it isn't, they're two very different types of reading tests and interpreting, because you have to do a very critical analysis and read close reading of any text for any of the AP classes, for any of the AP classes that involve reading or evidence-based support. You have to do a lot of close focused annotation type of things that you typically find in a normal reading test. That's not the case for this particular exam, although some of you might approach it that way if you have that experience, which is fine. But again, you just need to focus on what time you have and how long, if you might be a faster reader, so you might be able to get through and read it twice and do more of a critical analysis, which is fine, so long as you still are able to get to the questions and not get bogged down in the passages. Because the point really kind of the reading test on this exam is more to trick you. Like, honestly, they don't like you. They're not, I will say this over and over again, probably at least once every session, but the test makers are not your friends. So they're out to make you make some mistakes. So in every way, shape, and form possible. So that can be true on the AP exam, because they're not your friends either. But it's a very different kind of test. And I think as you kind of advance with your studies in general, you want to make sure that you are keeping in mind what the two different tests are for, okay, and what they're really demonstrating. So the AP curriculum would be focused more on college level work, whereas this is focused on whether or not you're college ready, whether or not you're able to do the college level work. So anyway, great. So we're kind of gonna just go through this passage, as well as, just to kind of go through the practice test. I can show you my annotations. But was the math or the English sections or the reading section easier or harder overall between the different sections of the test for anyone? Did anyone find one particular section to be more challenging or easier than you anticipated it to be for practice test 1? Okay. Well, if no one, some people felt it was easier. Okay. All right, so we're gonna kind of spend a few minutes looking at my annotations. Kind of going forward, we're gonna be doing that. So each week, as you kind of found out last week, I'll be sharing annotations with you, at least as often as possible, of the practice test that we do, so that you can see an example of what yours should look like. Granted, I don't expect you to underline quite as much as I do, but because I tend to over underline, but it just helps my reading process. So it doesn't necessarily, I would expect your annotations to look something like mine. Okay, so, and the more annotations you do, the easier it's going to be for you to find information in the text when you have to go back and find it for a question. Okay, so it's going to help you, and everyone's personal kind of system is going to be different, but I do have and unique to them, but I do have kind of a proven strategy, which we started going over last week at everyone's request, to really kind of see what techniques and strategies you can employ to help you succeed on this exam. Okay. So what we're going to do now, I just kind of want us to look through the annotations and kind of see how it looks and how my coding system looks. And then we're going to go through and I'm going to explain what the coding system is, which we started kind of doing last week. But just to kind of get you up to speed. So my apologies if my handwriting is a little bit sloppy here. I think I was in a bit of a rush when I had a chance to do this. So if there's anything you can't read or decipher, please let me know. I was doing this also kind of late earlier this week. So you can kind of see that I've done a lot of circling. I've done a lot of underlining, of course, as I said. I've also done some writing in the margins. I've made comments or noted things about the text. And I mean, I do usually come from a more critical reading and analysis type world in terms of my own approach to reading. So I am much more connected to the critical reading and analysis than what you need to be focused on doing for this test. So for this test, really, you want to be looking for things like keywords. You want to be looking for vocabulary words that you think that they might be asking you a question about, because chances are they will. And it's probably not when you expect it. Again, that's why vocabulary studies are helpful, but they're not the best. I mean, they help your strategy overall, and they're good for you in the long run for many different purposes, but they're not exactly what you need to be focusing on to be able to succeed on this test. So overall, kind of you can see like my note about Naomi and Akira down here. You can also see that I've coded the questions. You can see that I have very different kinds of, I've crossed off my answers using process of elimination. I've circled my answer. I have kind of labeled things. I've identified things in the questions and done underlining. I haven't necessarily in every single question underlined everything, because that would kind of be counterproductive. I've just kind of focused in on, like you can see on this question 5, I did which provides the best evidence. Even just that much tells me that this is an evidence support question, especially because it then says the answer to the previous question. So we know that this is a particular type of question that they ask on the SAT, and it's a relatively new one. So it's a particular question, and it's pretty easy to identify. Sometimes, like in this one, number 7, there's more than one type of code that you're going to see, because it's going to be covering different things at the same time. Okay, it depends on the type of question that they ask you. So here they're asking about the main purpose, but it's not the main purpose of it's not the overarching purpose of the passage. It's focused more on a paragraph level. So it's really just the main idea of a paragraph. Okay. But the main purpose, but because we're dealing with purpose and not just the idea, we're dealing with a usage and function type question as well. Okay. Here you have TD for text detail, and you have line 2. Because of line 2, okay, because it specifies a specific word from the text that it's providing it's a detail-oriented question, basically. And then it's also a usage question because it's asking how that word is being used and in a given context. This should actually also be vocabulary and context. I don't know why I didn't write that. Again, I think I was doing this rather quickly. So that I could scan it and have it for you. You can also kind of see that I've made kind of notations here, like gift giving / purchase equals reception, like appreciation of gift is not always true. So like just kind of, it's kind of convoluted a little bit, but it helped me understand what it was that the passage was talking about. So sometimes you only need to write more than just a word as kind of a keyword. And you can see I do a lot of phrasing. But I've also kind of highlighted aspects of the text so that I can go back and find it. Anyone have kind of questions about how, like about what their reading test section should look like? I'm going to go into how you do this and the step-by-step process in just a minute, but I want to make sure that everyone can kind of understand what I'm expecting them to kind of take away as a potential strategy for their test. And we're going to go through how to do this step-by-step process, although it was in your notes from last week. Okay. Even though we didn't get a chance to go through everything at that point, we'll go through it today. Okay. So if no one has any particular questions at this second, let's kind of take a quick look at the writing and language test. So we're just going to go through some of the annotations first, just so you can see them. And then I'm going to talk about them so you can have a frame of reference. Okay. Here you can see this is a purpose question for the entire passage. So because of that, it has a different code because it's a big picture question. Okay. Yeah, just here I made a note because it's totally about diction. Even though they're like vocabulary and context, usage, text detail. There are going to be a lot of questions that are a little bit like are going to be multi-dimensional questions because they're going to be asking you, like with number 52, it's an analogy type question because you're dealing with passage 1 and passage 2. It's asking you to make a comparison between the two different passages, which is one specific type of question. But specifically, it's asking you to look at kind of the dealing with, it's asking you to make a comparison specifically rather than about like the relationship between the passages, which you can see this one is more of a relationship type question because it's specifically saying just which statement best describes the relationship between the passages. So it's also an analogy type question, but it's specifically focused on relationships as opposed to comparisons. So we'll kind of see that when we go through. But looking at writing and language, I don't do as much underlining and circling in this because of the nature of this particular section of the test, but it is helpful for you in finding key details. But one thing I do recommend doing is circling at least any numbers that you see. Like I probably should have circled 1 and 2 and 3 but this is really showing you that it's the start of a sentence. And it's also so that you can use it in approaching like sentence 5, for instance. But you're dealing with kind of these big numbers that correspond to the particular question. So you want to circle those at the very least. They do underline some things so that you can know which sections of the test that you're looking at. So you do kind of want to pay attention to those, but you don't want to really annotate them because you need to be able to look at that response and compare it to the other answer choices for that particular question that is about. So I don't really do that much annotation here. But some students may find that it is beneficial for them to keep track of what the text is about, like underlining or making note in the margins about what a given topic is in a paragraph. That's perfectly fine to do. It's just not something that I specifically usually do when I go through a writing and language test. I tend to focus more on identifying the type of question when I'm answering, and then kind of focus more in on the passage itself. Okay. So, which is really what you need to do, because you always want to be moving towards the questions. So you can see that there can be a lot of different things. So this is idiomatic diction, precision of language. You have coherence, grammaticality, punctuation for items listed in a series, logic, reason, flow, organization. You have all these different kinds of, like, these are harder to code specifically. So there, you can also see some crossover between types of questions. And I think there was this specific one, like here. Question 12 was is basically a data response question. So it's going to be pretty similar to what you need to be thinking about for data response questions on the reading test, except that because it's dealing with a graph that's included in the passage. And sorry, I didn't mean to zoom out on that before. But you do want to be paying attention to things like that, because it's going to help you answer the questions. If you know that, oh, I should be focusing on finding this evidence. Okay. So that's kind of what the writing and language test is about, but we're going to go into specific details in just a second. Let's look a little bit at some of the math just for now, just to kind of see at a glance at what it's going to look like. And then we're going to go step by step through the reading tests in terms of your approach and writing language test. And we're going to continue to do this kind of exercise as we go forward until everyone's really comfortable and found a strategy that's working for them. And that you can just we can get to a point where you're just going through practice tests and we're just answering questions and addressing questions so that you can get as much experience as possible going through the test. Okay. So the math no calculator test, everyone should be familiarizing themselves with these formulae. Okay. This information, again, which I said last week, is going to be very, very important for this test, because chances are you're going to have some kind of question related to something in here. And a lot of the time they're not going to remind you about that, oh, what the formula is. You have to actually remember, oh, wait, I can't remember exactly what this formula is, but I know it's one at the beginning. Okay, so I can check my formula list. That's not to say that you won't use formula that's not listed on here. It is just kind of something you want to keep in your mind. And if you don't understand these concepts, you need to tell me so that we can specifically go through them. Otherwise, if no one has any questions, I'm going to assume that you know them. And I really don't like assuming things, but I tend to do the opposite and assume students don't know it, because chances are they think they do, and they don't necessarily fully understand it. So please tell me if you want us to go specifically step by step through any of those formulae or anything else. Okay. So again, I'm kind of minimalist when I go through the math sections. Although I don't think I did it this time, because again, I said I was a little pressed for time, but I do, just like I end up doing with the writing and language test and the reading test. For the questions, I underline or circle key information that's important for me to help solve the question, or to focus in on what the question is actually asking, as opposed to what they're trying to trick me about. Okay. So I would do things like underlining this equation, figuring out what P and the value of P and D what would be, and what that means. I'd be looking for, remind myself what imaginary numbers are, or irrational numbers are, and dealing with how to solve this type of equation, and just kind of general information from the text, so that I have all the tools necessary at my fingertips to solve it. And then I can figure out what's the best way to solve this, and or the easiest way to solve this so I waste less time. Okay. So there's for a lot of these questions, there's going to be a very complicated way to solve it through math. And more often than not, it's going to be a way that you don't actually need to be focused on. Like you don't need to solve it the complex way. You just need to solve it so that you can improve your response so that you can be able to find the right answer. And the key here is to be able to be smart about which problems you're solving and the order in which you do it. So you want to solve the easier ones first, same pattern that you want to be doing for the writing and language test and the reading test. Okay. So always solve the easier problems for you first, and then give yourself the extra time that you need to focus on the harder questions. And that's always kind of just a rule of thumb to kind of help you go through each of the sections on this test, really. You'll also notice I use process of elimination. I circled my actual answer. There is a section here when you get to the handwritten things. I didn't do my solving here for you. I did it on scrap paper. But I can walk through any of these for you if you need to go through them, or if they didn't make sense when you were reviewing the answers and explanations for this chapter or this particular practice test. I'm sorry. But basically, like I would probably circle my answer if it was on my scrap paper after having solved it. Okay. Same thing here, math calculator test, same formulae. Same kind of process of elimination and circling. Okay, so it kind of, even for the ones where you have to actually put in the answers, which is down here, I've made kind of notes, just kind of clarifying what I was solving for, which was X in this equation, and what it equaled. So kind of rephrasing the question to provide a concrete answer. Okay, so someone has a question. Okay, we will get to the non-calculator portion of the math test. I'm going to kind of go back and go through and we'll address your questions at that point. I want to kind of go through the strategies for the reading test and writing and language test first, so you can start really employing them in your practice test going forward before we delve into answering specific questions that you had on the test. So a little bit later today, we will go through specific questions from each practice test to make sure everyone's on the right page and knows how to solve things. Okay. And anything we can't get to, email me about, and I'd be happy to provide you with an explanation. Okay. So this just kind of gives you a gist of what your practice test should look like. You can solve your equations on the test as you're permitted. Just follow all instructions provided by the test for your exam. So before we really kind of look through the annotations, I do want to take a second and kind of look through our notes and kind of recap what we were learning about last week. So we started with, I just have to find specifically what I wanted. Okay. So everyone should again see their homework from today, which again, I'll send out at the end of class in the homework email. So anyone who needs to leave early or anything will have that as soon as you receive the homework email. Okay. But kind of recapping that we had started kind of just reviewing in general what the different sections of the test are, which are the reading test, the writing and language test, and the two different math tests. So you have the calculator and non-calculator portion, and the calculator section is the last section you take of this test. Everyone should really be thinking too about identifying your personal score goals so that you know, I mean, by now, having self-scored at least 2 different tests, you should have a better idea of where you are currently in terms of your scores. And as part of your whole college application process, you should kind of have an idea of the types of scores that you need to get into the schools that you are trying to attend. Okay, so remember, do your research, make sure that you are familiar with any score goals or other types of requirements that you need on particular sections of this test in order to be able to complete your college application process. Okay, and try to get it be in the ideal range to be admitted to your schools. Okay, so really, we kind of looked at the reading test notes and concepts. So remember, again, we were talking about taking about 12 minutes per passage to read and answer the questions. And by read, I mean reading ideally twice, but generally speaking, most students will be only reading it once. Okay, so you want to make the most of that short amount of time that you have to read, and you never want to be reading more than 5 minutes at a time, and include it with your annotations. Remember, the first time you read on the reading test is always for understanding, and that you're focusing and underlining things like keywords and concepts, coding the passage in terms of kind of how I was making annotations on the side. I was kind of putting like keywords and phrases in there to identify certain sections of the test. Like for instance, if we kind of look at that again, where did it go? Even just looking at this first passage, you can see I've made notes on the side. Okay, so that's what I mean by kind of coding the passage, because you don't necessarily, like, you can do hashtags, you can do something that's memorable for you to draw out key ideas from the text so that you can easily find them. So I kind of do this a little bit more on the science-based passages. So if we look at like this one, symbolic ritual, gift giving builds positive relationships and experiences, but not for all. Kind of anthropology, economy, positive equals positive, economy equals more negative kind of viewpoint, just kind of giving me something to grasp onto to find the answers when I'm being asked a question about it. Okay. Overspending like those types of things are what you want to be doing in terms of your coding. Does that all make sense? Everyone with me so far? I mean, this should kind of be review from last week. So kind of looking back. Okay, good. All right, so everyone seems to be on the same page for now. So dealing with things like, you want to be circling proper nouns and numbers, and everyone should know what a proper noun is. So a noun, of course, being a person, place, thing, or idea, and a proper noun being the name of a specific person, place, thing, or idea. Okay, pretty straightforward, I think, in terms of grammar concepts. That's one of the more straightforward ones, or at least I hope it is. So circling proper nouns and numbers is really helpful for you, because you can find those circling much more easily than you can find, like, if you had to actually skim through the entire test, the entire passage, trying to find just one number and then realize it's not the right number, I need to keep looking for the right one. Then you can more easily go back and find your answer because you've circled them all as you were reading. So it's a really helpful tool, and it's probably one of the best tools for this entire test, is to do that, to circle proper nouns and numbers, as well as doing underlining. So and coding the passage also kind of works for the reading test in particular, but underlining keywords and concepts now and circling proper nouns and numbers is true for any section of this test. Okay. Basically, we want to be focused on finding main ideas, looking at topic sentences and concluding sentences and details. Topic sentences and concluding sentences in particular should help you figure out what a particular section of a passage is about. So what a particular paragraph is about. So if you're kind of getting lost in the content or it's a very long paragraph, you might want to focus more on like the first few sentences or the last few sentences of that paragraph to get a gist of what the paragraph is about. You want to also be looking at any key details from the sentence, from the whole passage, or from a particular paragraph in terms of the names of studies that they might be referencing or people that they might be referencing. Again, dealing with circling proper nouns and identifying numbers and things like that. But you want to be looking for that kind of information, as well as kind of the outline of their argument. Okay, so that's going to help you. Or if it's a story, kind of the key events that are happening in the story or characters being mentioned or things that you think are important to the overall kind of narrative that you see. Okay, so that's kind of just your general approach, and kind of your annotation strategy a little bit here. And again, we kind of went through this last week in terms of general concepts like main idea questions, detail type questions, diction or words and context type questions, or vocabulary and context type questions. You have precision and concision of language. You have cohesion and flow of ideas. You have logic and reasoning. And there are any number of different kinds of approaches, but the kind that I think is the best approach is doing this coding, in terms of identifying the specific questions, the specific types of questions, because figuring out what type of question something is going to help you approach the ones that you can answer more easily first, and then work your way to the harder questions, okay, without getting distracted by harder questions that you can't answer because you don't quite fully understand what the passage is saying. Does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah, so far? All right. So big picture type questions are it's one of the main categories of questions that you'll see on the reading test. You'll see that kind of in some of the writing and language tests too, in reference to an author's kind of purpose or purpose in writing or their sort of rhetorical strategy or point of view. You might be looking at like theme or like argumentative claim or persuasive claim, depending on the type of writing you're dealing with, or thesis statements, things like that. You're going to be dealing with a lot. Basically, so my apologies. So basically, we have different types of questions on this test, and it's helpful to know so it's helpful to know really just how to approach them. So any big picture type of question that's an overarching kind of concept is going to basically help you be able to, where on earth was I going with this? So basically to help you kind of get through the passage, like ultimately any type of big overarching concept question is one you want to answer last. Okay, so it's because you want to focus on detail oriented questions first before you kind of move on to deeper level questions, or questions that will require your ability to kind of understand beyond just a sentence level or word level to a paragraph level to a section level to an entire passage level. Or comparing if you're dealing with the paired passage to different passages. Okay. So you want to kind of focus on those. And then we can kind of go from there. So big picture questions are your last question that you focus on. Little picture detail questions are ones you focus on first, because they can help give you the building blocks to get to those big picture questions. And they're the easiest to answer because a lot of the time they will be giving you a specific line number or a specific word in a text that you can look for, something to help you find what you need to be looking for in the text. Although some of the detail-oriented questions will not include a specific line number or a particular paragraph number or passage. Well, anything that has more than one passage will reference this particular passage, but just to be clear between the two. But the single passages, they're not going to say, oh, I mean, they might not tell you specifically where it is. So you have to actually hunt for it. And that's why your underlining and everything is going to be really helpful. Okay, so I think that what we can do right now, let's take a quick 5-minute break. And then we're going to kind of dive into the step-by-step process, and we'll get into the kind of breakdown and answering your questions. So everyone can have kind of like a 5-minute break. We'll reconvene about 10:51. I mean, not 10:51, 9:51. So I'm thinking like an hour ahead. But we'll take another little break closer to the math section so that we can later on. So I think the one break that we had last week was a little too short for some people. So why don't we do that and get everyone can have a quick break, and I'll see everyone in about 5 minutes and we'll resume. Okay. Okay. So everyone should be back now from a quick little break. So thank you for your patience. We were having, a few students were having some technical difficulties. So hopefully they're resolved now. I think I was still muted, so my apologies. So everyone, we should be back by now. We had a little bit of technical difficulties for a few students that were trying to be resolved and should be resolved now. So we're going to pick up where we just were with our notes. Okay, so everyone should be back from a nice little stretch break. And then, so we were talking about big picture questions and little picture detail questions on the reading test. Inferencing questions are another type of question, and they're usually the next question after a detail question you want to answer, because they're going to be asking you to, it's going to build off of what you know from the details. In most cases. So it's going to require making a logical assumption based on details and evidence in the passage. Some kinds of examples of types of inferencing questions can be ones that are inferring the meaning, asking you to infer the meaning of a paragraph or a line in the passage, determining implications of a statement in the passage, making a logical kind of conclusion about opinions stated by passage authors or characters, like inferring information or making a deduction based off of your knowledge of a character or an individual in a particular passage, such as an author. Okay. You also have function usage questions. So function usage questions, as I did kind of give you a few little examples, which we looked at when we briefly looked at the annotations so far. They ask you really to figure out what the purpose or effect of a line or paragraph is in the context of a passage. Figure out why. It could also ask you to figure out why the author used certain phrasing in the passage, or used a particular word in a given context, or made a particular choice. as an author, as a writer. So in terms of achieving their overall purpose without being an actual purpose of writing type of question, which is a different type of question. So you have function and usage are kind of versatile. You'll see them many times dealing with how language is being used or how particular content's being used, how ideas are being expressed and why, different kinds of things like that. So they're kind of versatile in terms of being multidimensional and being able to be part of those more complex multidimensional type questions that I've talked to you about. That could be like text detail, it could also be function and usage, or it could be like main idea, different types of things like that, where you have many different types of questions kind of rolled into one. So they like to do that. They like to make things more confusing. So in hoping that you will be confused by some aspect of the question, but you're smarter than that. I know that. So you are going to be able to overall see what they're up to and be able to say, nope, I know what kind of question this is. I can solve it and move on. Okay. Vocabulary and context questions are things that are exactly that. They're dealing with words. They're dealing with words in a particular context. So they're asking you to define or determine the definition of a word as it's used in the context of a passage. It focuses on nuances of words rather than standard definitions. So you might think you know a word, but you need to be paying attention to how it's being used in a given context, which is how they will try to trick you, is by getting you to basically say, hey, I know this word, I know what it means, and you're going to choose that answer choice, and it's not the right one, not how that particular word is being used, because they like to use things like the secondary or tertiary or further on meanings, like those types of things. In terms of, so they're not like your standard usage of a particular word. It could be an antiquated usage of a particular word, especially if the text is an older text. Okay. So that's also why circling information in the blurb that accompanies the passage and identifying the time period it was written in, and the kind of the temporal kind of context of the piece, and kind of bearing in mind like what maybe historical events were going on at the time that might be influencing or affecting this writer's work, or kind of thinking on, in which case it is kind of similar a little bit to the AP curriculum a little bit, because it's making you make those types of connections, but you make that type of connection regardless of what type of class, like what type of text you're dealing with. You have to think about not only what the literal sense of what the text is saying, but beyond that. And they like to try to trick you with things like that. So that's why you want to pay attention to the time a piece is written in, and kind of the background and things of the author, because it's going to make you make more informed decisions regarding the text as a whole, and about help you answer things like challenging vocab questions, which require you to know meanings that are less common. Okay. So hopefully everyone's on the same page so far. So analogy type questions, I mean, this again should all be reviewed from last week. So analogy type questions are making a comparison between a condition or relationship described in the passage and a condition or relationship that is not mentioned in the passage. So analogies are basically comparisons in the context of the SAT. Okay, so they are focused on two different types. So you're dealing with the condition one, which is marked with a C. It can also be represent comparison, because they're kind of a little bit interchangeable. So basically you have different types of analogy types questions that are going to be asking you to look and identify conditions or relationships. It's also going to be asking you to find things that are like to make connections to things not mentioned in the passage. So you have to kind of think beyond the text in these types of questions, in some instances. So you're basically looking for and detecting underlying similarities between something in the passage and a separate kind of hypothetical situation. So they're trying to give you an example and have you make a connection to something that's similar in most cases. Okay. So author technique questions are another type. There are rare. You might get one, a rare type of question. You may get one or two at most on a test. Most of the time, they're going to be things like tone, or it could be a style type question, but that usually falls more under rhetorical strategies. You could be dealing with other similar kind of concepts in terms of like technique, using things like imagery, or metaphor or simile or figurative language, or any number of things, depending on the type of passage that you're dealing with. But those are the kinds of technique oriented questions you'll see. You'll see a diverse range, but most common tends to be tone type questions. Sometimes they'll throw in another type of technique in there, but you won't see them as often. Evidence support type questions we kind of talked about a little bit earlier on. So you have basically they're questions that are focused on providing evidence to support your answer for another question. Ultimately, that's what they are, and that's ultimately what they do. They're very easy to identify, especially the standard kind of form that they come on, that they appear in on most sections of the reading test. There may be one or two evidence support questions that are a little less obvious in terms of their phrasing, but you should still be able to, and technically really any question on this test that is going to ask you to provide evidence could fall under this kind of category. So again, you have many multi-dimensions to the overall type of questions that you see, or a certain question might have more than one type or category that it falls under. So really, you're going to be looking for questions that, like I can actually give you a concrete example so you can see on the annotations. So if we actually go to like here, question 5, in our first passage, this is the most standard form for evidence support questions. So which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? That's the standard form for the majority of evidence support questions. Sometimes you might find something that isn't directly stating it's an evidence support question, but it technically is, because it's asking you to find evidence in the text to support a particular claim or an idea or some aspect of the text, to be able to kind of move forward with the questions. So that being said, let's kind of go back to our notes here. There. I always have too many documents. Windows open. Okay, so again, really answer evidence support questions, really just ask you to answer questions about the passage, particularly inferencing type questions or detail questions. And then the next question is the evidence support question, or it might be very close to the question, the evidence support, or to the question that you need to go back to, that is the previous question. Usually it's literally right before the evidence support question, that you'll have an inferencing question or a detail-oriented question. Because especially when you see that specific kind of phrasing that we just looked at, that is like saying from the previous question, is literally the question right before it. So that's going to kind of help you also in identifying what type of question that previous one was, so that you can then answer that and then get the right answer in terms of finding your evidence and providing the evidence to answer the evidence support question. Okay, that kind of builds off of that. And again, this is kind of a new type of SAT question. Data reasoning questions are generally pretty straightforward, I find. They are ones that are going to be about, and they're easy to identify because they're going to be asking you to, they're going to involve infographics that, or graphs or charts or things of that nature that are supplemental data to support the evidence or support the overall argument and content in the rest of the passage. So it can include figures, graphs, charts, infographics, etc., that show data, basically. So those are all questions that are going to require you to interpret data in the figure and place it in the context of the overall passage. So you have to not only look at whatever it is, whatever the infographic is that they're providing you, and analyze and interpret data from that, but you have to then make connections to the text, because everything in a given passage should relate to each other. What they try to do to trick you is to make like a flaw in the author's interpretation of a particular bit of data, and or not have there be evidence in the text. So everything always connects to each other. It's just like anytime you do you're writing, you will always have something that is like, you should always have a thesis statement that is basically the binding thread connecting everything, every aspect of your essay, or whatever type of or if you're dealing with like a theme in if you're doing a narrative or something like that, that you have something that's some kind of central concept that is connecting everything together, sewing everything together to keep it together, or kind of just as another kind of metaphor, like if you're I don't really know anything else that works quite as well as like the binding thread, really. Like it's the glue, so to speak. There you go, there's another one. A glue that is kind of keeping everything together, because it's like the skeleton that is keeping every bit of your text together. So you really want to be looking at the text in the context of your data response questions, because you're not only going to be looking at the specific graph or chart or whatever that is showing the data and interpreting and analyzing that, but you're going to also be looking for evidence that the author is on the right track with their interpretation and analysis, as well as to make sure that the chart and the text are connected, that they are relevant to each other and actually supporting each other. So this type of question really asks you kind of two main types. So it can require you to assess how the chart or graph supports the author's argument. And it can also require you to make inferences about the author's interpretation of data. So generally it will be one or the other of those type of data type questions, but it's helpful for you to bear in mind that you always want to be looking to make sure that the chart and the text are connecting to each other. So you always kind of want to look at it from both perspectives anyway, to help you then focus on, oh, okay, so I need to focus on, they are in fact connecting. So you're analyzing the data, and you're analyzing the data from the text, and then you are then making a judgment based on, is the author's interpretation right? Or is the chart or whatever it is actually supporting what the author is saying. And if it's not, then making sure that you find the right answer that is saying that. Okay. So, I mean, those are kind of the general types of questions you'll see on the reading test. The general types of questions you'll see on the writing test are things like grammar concepts. You're going to be dealing with a lot of grammar concepts. Not just grammar concepts, though. You're going to be dealing with editing techniques and revision strategies and writing techniques and reading and interpretation of the information. So you're going to act as author. You're going to be acting as reader. You're going to be acting as reader/audience. You're going to be dealing with acting as editor in terms of making proper choices to make sure a piece ends up being grammatically correct, that it is making sense in terms of its relationship of like it's how it's conveying its ideas, whether or not all the ideas make sense, whether or not they are like everything kind of flows smoothly from one to another. So thinking really along the lines of those rubrics that you really see mostly in school, where you are kind of keeping those things in mind when you're doing a writing assignment. You're thinking about, okay, how should this sound in order for it to meet all of these kind of criteria? So you're kind of checking off boxes in a lot of these in terms of dealing with concepts like knowledge and grammar and mechanics of language, standard English conventions, expression of ideas. So things like syntax, organization, flow, evidence and supporting details, strength of argument, rhetorical techniques and strategies, use of things even like figurative language, if it's appropriate for a given text, or using evidence to support ideas. Okay. Like that's a big one that you're going to see a lot of. You're also going to be dealing with things like your editing skills. How do we revise this sentence or this word or this paragraph or this passage as a whole to make it make sense for a reader, for an audience? Okay. And you're going to be focused on a lot of punctuation questions. You're going to be focused on redundancy and repetition, data interpretation and analysis. These are the main kind of key concepts that you're going to see, as well as the key kinds of question types. Grammar, though, is a big one in terms of the range of grammar concepts that they cover. I have provided lists for you of the different types of questions, and I will later today kind of and in future sessions really break down some of these key ideas for you so you can see them. But I'm not going to kind of belabor every single thing because you have this from your notes from last time. Okay. And we'll go into more depth, but I do want to kind of move on because I know last time we also really looked at the general strategies like SQ3R, RipRap, skim reading, scanning. By now I'm expecting that if you weren't aware what these were, that you kind of reviewed this last week as part of your homework routine and kind of explored the resources that were on the Khan Academy SAT section of the College Board's website to kind of clarify what those are. So those are some techniques. Has anyone been employing those? Has anyone been using those particular strategies when they're reading? The SQ3R, the RipRap, the skim reading and the scanning. I would expect skim reading more so than any of the others. So has anyone been using, have they found that the SQ3R, RipRap, or scanning kind of technique is helpful for them on the reading passages, or is it mostly that you're just finding that, like I'm predicting, that you're doing skim reading and you're following the strategy of coding and annotation that's really going to be your key to success on the reading test? Any feedback? No? Okay. And we'll kind of move on. Okay, so some people do find rip rep helps, and then or some of these techniques might be helpful for some. Okay, that's perfectly valid. Whatever strategies work for you is your best plan. So everyone's different. So just because one technique works for someone doesn't mean that it's going to be the best solution for everyone. It depends on what type of reader you are, what type of test taker you are, and just kind of your knowledge in general and how you approach texts like these. Okay. So great. So awesome. So the kind of content we have, again, just to kind of recap about the reading test, you have 65 minutes again for 52 questions to answer, which includes any time you have to read for the passages. So ideally you're reading 12, you're spending about 12 minutes per passage, including the paired passage, which equates to about 1 minute and 15 seconds per question, which includes your reading time. Okay. Everyone this week should have an idea at least about which order of passages works best for you. So whether or not you approach the literature passage first, or if you focus on a founding father kind of document, so more of a history-based type piece or humanities-based piece first, or if you're focusing on more on a social science topic like psychology, or you're dealing with the two science, like the two traditional science-based concepts like earth science, chemistry, physics, all of that. So, or if you're doing the paired passage first, if you like doing that kind of comparisons and that's the easiest for you, then fine. Then please go forward and continue with that. So everyone should know which order of those passages that they're doing for the moment. It can always change. Okay. So if you've decided that you're going to start with the literature and go down to science, that's fine. But if you find later on as we go forward in our studies that the literature passages aren't the easiest now for you to get through, or that they might be, they started out that way and then they're changing, it's fine for you to change the order in which you do your passages. You always want to be focused on what's working for you in this moment, what is working for you in this particular practice test, because each of the practice tests are different from one another. They're not exactly the same, and I mean they offer the same kinds of content in terms of their text complexity, in terms of their like the range of material that they cover, or the like technical amount of technical jargon that they throw at you in a given passage, like especially like science. But those types of things can change depending on which practice test you're taking or which exam you're taking in a given administration cycle. So those are things that you want to know, that your strategies are designed to be used consistently, and it's in your best interest to use these strategies consistently from practice test to practice test, so that you can improve your overall endurance and improve your approach to each of those questions, and you can just get better and better and better, because practice makes perfect on this exam, like with anything. Okay. But that being said, you also really want to consider that if something's not working for you anymore, and it might have started out working for you with your test taking strategy, every part of your test taking strategy is designed so that you can adapt, so that you have as many tools in your arsenal as possible, so that you can succeed ultimately, you want to be adaptable on this test because you never really know what exactly they're going to throw at you. I mean, that's true with the vocabulary studies. That's true with the specific types of questions. You just know the general types of questions that they're going to be giving you. You don't know how many necessarily of each type, although there are kind of some patterns from over the years, like the technique questions being very more on the rare side for the reading test than other types of questions. So there are patterns, so to speak, on certain aspects of the test, but in general, you want your strategies, you want to have multiple strategies that you can use so that in the context of completing a particular practice test, you can change gears and say, I don't understand this passage at all. So reading through the whole thing is no longer useful for me. So I need to switch my strategy to one that I would use if I'm struggling with a passage, or to switch it to something that I'm not understanding, like to get me through so I can get to the questions, because the questions are always your end game. Does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. So really, once you've kind of determined which order you do those passages, so everyone should have at least some kind of idea by this point of what they're tentatively going forward with, so that you should know whether or not the literature passage is the hardest for you or the science ones are. So you should know, based on the two different tests that you've taken so far, what your own tendencies are, and what your own individual comfort level is with the content, with those content areas of the humanities versus the literary passages, or the science or social science type subjects. Like, you need to know those kinds of things going into figuring out what your strategy is, so that you can then approach each test in a way that is the most efficient for you and will give you the highest probability of getting the greatest number of questions correct on any given test. Okay. So generally speaking, again, we've kind of covered it. You want to aim for about 12 minutes per passage on the reading test. So now that we've kind of really figured out what your particular preferred order is, you want to focus more on refining your use of time. Okay. So you want to make sure, that's why you should be having a timer as you take each section, or and a clock available, so, or a stopwatch, so that you can keep track of how much time you spend on each passage. So maybe you can't do the 12-minute, or that's not the best time allotment for you. Then we can adjust your strategy based on your particular needs. And that will vary depending on the type of reader you are, and the content material that you're reading, and the complexity of it. And any given test day, like how well rested you were, how much fuel you gave yourself in terms of like healthy eating before your test. All of those things contribute to the amount of time you can ultimately spend on each section, or each part of a section, to get you through to the questions and get you through the test. So you want to kind of be cognizant of that, to be aware of that as you go forward. Some students in particular can find that they struggle in certain sections or run out of stamina. But you always want to start strong and try to end strong if you can. Okay, so that means being smart about how you approach the test, being smart about your pacing, like being aware of your pacing and your particular needs on a given test. Consistency is crucial. You want to, of course, be trying to be as consistent as possible, but remember that you should also be adaptable. So you should always have many different kind of backup plans, and kind of, or other tools in your toolbox, so to speak, to be able to get you through each section of the test so you can adapt to what you're given on a test. Does anyone find the paired passage to be the trickiest? It's okay if it is. That tends to be, for a lot of students, that can be the trickiest one, because you are not only having to read and remember about one passage that might be very dense, but you also have to read and compare it to and remember a second passage. So that is a kind of consistent challenge for most students in terms of the paired passage. But if you're someone who likes making comparisons or can easily connect two different texts together, then maybe that isn't a challenge for you. But if it is, that's fine. You just want to be aware so that you can adjust your strategy as needed, and make sure that you're approaching it in an appropriate order. Okay. Last week, I also kind of mentioned about process of elimination, I believe. So process of elimination, all of you, I think, should be aware of this from any other tests that you've taken in the past, especially if they were multiple choice questions in particular. But process of elimination basically is to help you do your answer choices, like choose your answer choices. And if we actually look at my annotations here, you can see I do that all throughout the test. So every time I'm slashing through just the letter, and then I'm circling the one that is my answer, so that I know clearly this is my answer. It's not this one. So even in kind of when I'm a little bit unclear in some of them here, because I was writing quickly or my pencil wasn't really working the way I wanted it to, I can still see clearly D is my right answer on question 7. Okay. So those are kind of things that you want to be able to keep in mind as well. You want to be able to you want to be able to mark your answers and still be able to see the answer choices. So anytime that you go back to check your answers, you can do so without having to worry through or make a hole in your test booklet as you are trying to erase your crossing out of an answer choice because you spent the time crossing everything off and shading it in or whatever. You want to eliminate as much time, and doing just a simple slash like I did on the annotations is your best way to go about that. And don't even bother doing an X because that's wasting time. Okay, so it can be something like this, like you can kind of see the A, B, C, D, or you have it like just crossing, doing a horizontal line, or it can be like a slash like I did. Okay, whatever works for you, but the point is to basically make sure that you are minimizing the amount of time you're spending, the amount of effort you're putting into it, so you can conserve your energy and you can also still be able to see your answers, the answer choices available. So when you go back to look at it, you can. Okay. And again, the reason you do that for process of elimination is so that you can have a higher probability to get the correct answer. Okay. All right. So that all kind of being said, if you haven't really done this part yet, I want everyone to do it this week as you're completing kind of, you can do it with practice test 10, which is your assignment for this week too. But you want to start trying to identify the question types that are most challenging for you and identify ones that are the easiest for you. So now that you have kind of determined what your preferred order for passages are on the reading test, you can also, should start kind of identifying the types of questions that you get wrong, and how, like what type of error you're making, whether it's a careless error because you just didn't read more thoroughly, or you didn't underline or circle like you should have. Or if it's an error where you don't understand the content or the question that's being asked. So the former that I just mentioned was something that you can easily fix. So careless errors in reading, in underlining or not underlining, or circling like you should, annotating like you should. Those are things that we can quickly fix and can get you immediately points back on your test when you start really taking in that you need to be doing the annotation and the kind of coding and things like that. You want to be able to do that. You want to be able to look and identify the types of questions you're making, as well as the types of errors you're making. If it's an error in content, in understanding content, or in understanding what the question was asking, that's going to take a little bit more time for us to help you through, which is fine. But I want us to fix like easy questions, or the easy mistakes first, because that's going to immediately get you points, and you can start going through every single question like that and gaining points going forward. Then once we do that, we can more easily focus on challenging content areas going forward. Okay, so that we can, or how to address specific questions, especially the harder type questions that are more challenging for most students. Okay, so you should be thinking about not only your timing and your preferred order of passages, but the kinds of questions that you get wrong. And this is true too on any section of this test going forward. Yes, we haven't really gone through specific types of math questions, but you should be able to identify the type of math question it is based on what it's asking you to do. And a lot of them are going to be like heart of algebra type questions, where they're focused on an algebraic expression or equation, or some aspect of that you have to kind of solve for. They're going to be geometry based questions, or there's going to be other ones that you might be like plugging in information for, that could be like you made a miscalculation that needs to be fixed, or something like that, or you forgot that the question was focused on angles when it was also talking about degrees, or something like that, like, or it's a technical not knowing how to use your calculator appropriately for the calculator section. Those are things that are a little bit easier to fix. So you should be identifying that and letting me know in our next session which types of questions are the most challenging for you, and what kinds of errors you're making, so that we can kind of focus, and I can kind of add additional workshops or whatever we need for focusing on particular types of questions. Okay. You can kind of read through this. This was from the notes, but just the overall strategy for the reading passage, and then we'll get to the writing and language test, is how to approach the reading passages. So everyone should be memorizing the instructions to every section of this test. Okay, at least as much as possible. So just at least familiarize yourself with them enough that you are comfortable with what they're going to be asking you to do, so that you only really have to skim through them to make sure they're not going to throw any new changes at you when you're faced with the test. So reading the introductory information of the passage, again, this is more for the reading test, where you're dealing with like key information about the author, context, and subject matter. Kind of, we talked about this last week, so I'm not going to really get into it more, and it's in your notes so you can read it. But read the passage and annotate as you read. That's your main strategy for this test to succeed on this test. On the reading test in particular, it's vital, but it's important on any section of this exam. Okay. So when you're reading at least once, trying to focus on getting to the questions. Okay. So don't get bogged down by reading. We did kind of go through this last time. So you're not spending more than 5 minutes reading any passage. That's part of that 12 minutes per allotment for, so make sure you're reading in each passage in under 5 minutes so that you can have the most amount of time, the greatest amount of time to read, to get through the questions for that particular passage. Annotations, again, you should be doing that while you're reading. So you shouldn't be spending, again, more than 5 minutes doing your annotations. So that's why you're doing them as you read. And if you are, then we can limit the types of annotations you're doing. If your annotation is taking too long, and it's slowing down your reading, or if it's not being helpful for you, although in 99.9% of the cases that I've experienced, it's going to help you. Annotation is essential to this test. So again, we kind of covered all of this. This is just kind of like reminding you about keywords and phrases, circling proper nouns, all that we kind of went over at the very beginning today. Labeling the question type. So that's coding the questions. So that's doing things like identifying, here are kind of my labels that we didn't really get a chance to fully go through, but we talked about these different types of questions. So you have D for detail oriented or diction type questions, TD for specific detail, VIC for vocabulary and context. You have I for inferencing, ES for evidence support, which you've seen on my annotations. You see T for technique questions, DR for data reasoning, U for function usage, A for analogy type questions, and then you also have things like R for relationship or C for condition. I recommend that students really kind of focus on the ones in bold, if you have time or if it makes sense for you and it helps you remember it more, like it does for me. Add the subtypes that I have here. Okay. Big picture type questions are the last type of question, and there are a lot for that category. So that can be things like central concepts, themes, or thesis, or central concept, theme, thesis, or claim. You also have main idea. So generally, main idea refers to main idea of a paragraph, and central concept, thesis, claim, theme is going to be more for the overarching main idea of the entire passage, or passages. Okay. Point of view. So that's generally, again, the author's point of view or a character's point of view. It could also be dealing with you also have purpose questions where dealing purpose of the passage or purpose of writing, as opposed to the types of function usage questions that sort of overlap with that category, that focus on a word, a sentence, or a paragraph level type of purpose, or organizational purpose in pointing something, or focusing on particular ideas, in terms of like rhetorical strategy. RS for rhetorical strategy. If you're not sure what I mean by rhetorical strategy, please let me know. So I'm going to assume that all of you have at least heard that before, if not from my previous kind of discussion with you. But rhetorical strategy really has to do with like authors writing like in particular, you think of like argumentative writing or persuasive techniques that you use, or strategy that you use to convince, like to strengthen your argument or to persuade your audience or your reader or your listener or whatever to support your ideas. So that might be something through like an emotional appeal to the audience, or through logic and reasoning that you're appealing to their sense of kind of reasoning there, or you're dealing with their a cause that they support, or you're dealing with kind of their sense of morality, their sense of kind of is this a right practice? Like those types of things. You're also dealing with like tone, like in a way you're also dealing with tone where you're or style or any kind of writing technique overall. Okay, does that all make sense to everyone? All right, so I'm not going to belabor this because we've really kind of gone through all of these already, and it's in your notes so you can look through it, but it provides more information about each of the different types of questions and kind of the preferred order. So the preferred order really is to focus again on detail oriented. So the easiest type questions, the simplest type questions first, the ones that they give, especially the ones that they give you a textual reference for, okay? Or they tell you specifically what you're supposed to be looking for. Those are ones you want to focus on first. So ones that give you a line number, or they say in the first paragraph or something like that, or they give you an actual word to find in the context of a given passage. Those types of questions you want to focus on first. And they consist of any other general kind of little picture detail questions related that are detail oriented questions, and that you're also dealing with vocabulary and context. Those are the kind of main questions you'll see. Inferencing questions is next. So after you tackle detail, you want to focus on inferencing because you need the detail again to build to the inferencing questions. Evidence support questions are the logical next choice because detail oriented and inferencing questions typically precede evidence support questions and are connected or related to what you're having to answer for an evidence support type question. Okay, make sense so far, everyone? Yeah. Okay. Author technique type questions, those are the next ones you want to, they're a technical question, but they're also detail oriented in a way. They're asking you to make connections to the passage that you're reading to identify what kind of language are they using, is the author using, or why, or what techniques, like literary techniques or rhetorical kind of writing techniques are they using to in this particular instance, and why. So those types of things, like again, dealing with imagery or dealing with onomatopoeia, dealing with illusion, dealing with all those types of things. Okay. The next question, after you kind of focus on those technically or like oriented types questions, you're going to be dealing with data reasoning questions. So these are still dealing with specific information because the data is always there for you, and it's going to be, the evidence is always there in the text for you. So you want to be answering those questions next because they're going to be easier for you to find or understand than to think about the next type of question, which is function and usage type questions. So function and usage type questions can require you to take a step back in terms of your thinking and understanding of what the question is asking, so that you can figure out, okay, how is this actually being used in the text by the author, or why is the author using it? So you have to think a little bit more critically than just simply finding data or making a quick deduction or connection to like if you're inferring information or something from the text. It's a little bit more involved because it requires you to think and put yourself in the position of the author as a writer, of why they're doing that, and understand how the author is using language and what the function or purpose of a particular sentence being placed in a certain way or a particular word in a given context is, why they chose that word in particular, or why they're choosing to focus on a particular idea in a given moment. So those types of things are a little bit more involved. So you want to do them after tackling the things that you have evidence immediately there that you can just find. Okay. Analogy type questions are next. So those also require taking a little bit of a step back because you have to think, okay, are they making a relationship type? Like, am I looking at the relationship here? Am I looking at the kind of connection between these passages, like how their comparison, why they're like, are they related, or are there circumstances that are similar that I'm supposed to be like understanding and piecing together and seeing, and that are paralleling each other, or that they're contrasting in some way. So you have to think about it a little bit more critically. So these are off after you get through the function usage questions. Okay. So they require things like thinking of hypothetical situations with events, conditions, or relationships in the passage. It can also require just straightforward comparing conditions and or relationships in the passage with similar circumstances or relationships not mentioned in the passage. Okay, so they're a little trickier. Big picture type questions are, again, the last type question you focus on for reading strategies for any reading test here. So big picture questions, mainly point of view of the author, essentially, or of a particular character, purpose of the passage. So why, like the overarching purpose of the passage, as opposed to a specific usage of a particular paragraph in terms of the overall context of the narrative, like the value of that particular paragraph, or the function that paragraph serves, which would be more function usage. Okay. Rhetorical strategy of the author. So that, again, you're dealing with authors' writing techniques, authors' argumentative techniques, their ability to achieve their purpose, the tools that they have in their arsenal to basically get their point across and to make connections to their audience and convey their message. So again, you're dealing with things like message, purpose. You're dealing with a lot of different aspects of writing, key elements of writing, and being what it means to be an author, and what you're dealing with in terms of writing and editing type things, and what the meaning that's being conveyed to the audience could be, and why an author is choosing a particular way or a particular technique or particular style of writing to be able to achieve their purpose, and whether or not they are effective at it, whether or not they are able to achieve that ultimately. Okay, so you're both being analyzer and kind of interpreter there in terms of assessing what the author is actually using. Okay. We've kind of talked about this in terms of timing, so I'm not going to kind of go through that. But just kind of, does that, do those strategies really kind of make sense for everyone for the reading test? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on how to kind of approach the passage? So if we kind of look even at the annotations here. So remember, you're going to be reading through, like skimming through the instructions, because you need to generally try to memorize it, or at least become familiar enough with it that you can just quickly read through it, to note that there are no changes, then really focus on the passage and the questions. So doing things like your annotations, doing your kind of coding in the margins, kind of providing keywords or phrases, identifying those in the context of a given given passage. Okay, so that you can then get to the point that you can focus on the questions, using things like process of elimination to help you narrow down your answer choices and have a higher probability of getting the question right, using coding to identify which question order you should be doing. So understanding, like underlining key elements of a question so that you can help yourself focus on a given, like what the question is actually asking you to do, as opposed to letting yourself get lost in the language. So doing coding to help you figure out that, oh, the question number 1 on this practice test, I should have done that one last, even though it's the first question. And knowing that on this exam, you don't have to do the questions in each section in order that they appear. That's part of how they try to trick you, is by making you think that you have to do it in chronological order. That's not the case. You do have to focus on just the questions for one passage at a time, or one paired passage at a time. But you also want to be focused on what it is that you need to get through. You need to get through the questions. Okay, so you can only focus on one test of the exam at a time. So you can only focus on the reading test and focus on particular passages one by one. But that doesn't mean that you can't skip around and answer the question. So long as you're careful of noting that and making sure that you're putting your answer choice in the correct bubble or slot on your answer sheet. Okay. So yeah. And then again, coding, like that's how it really kind of should look, evidence support, like that type of thing. So kind of going back to before we kind of delve into a little bit more with the writing test, before we switch gears to math and kind of go over your questions on the test from this week, I do want to briefly note what the exam test, like the test makers have kind of, how they've kind of labeled their content. So they've, as you should know from doing the reading this week, you should know that they classify the reading test content as 3 different areas. They classify it as information and ideas, rhetoric, you're dealing with synthesis. Those are kind of the key areas that they classify as the content on the reading test, which I would agree that those are general kind of, very general kind of content areas or types of questions or types of applications of these types of questions. But really, I feel that the types of questions that they really actually are asking you are the ones that I've labeled. So things are big picture, little picture, inference. These are the actual technical question types that you see. They might fall into these kind of overarching ideological categories. So about, in terms of their general content. So synthesis being like your analysis and interpretation of information, an application of that material. So you're thinking of critical thinking skills really related to the content that you're reading. Rhetoric is your ability to really kind of focus on language use, techniques that are related to language use, which you can see are part of the questions that we've definitely looked at. And then information and ideas is really focused on concepts and key ideas from the text. So in terms of their subject area content, and in terms of data that you're looking at. Okay. So does that all kind of make sense? Everyone can kind of read through this too as you go through. This is just, again, more information about the types that we've already talked about for today. And this, again, was from your notes from last week that were shared through the homework email. So you have access to this. The writing and language test, again, I know we kind of talked about it earlier, is focused on the timing is 8 minutes as opposed to the 12 minutes you need for the reading test. And again, that's inclusive of your reading time for the passages. And again, you want to follow the same kind of principle that you do with the reading test and focus on reading the passage at least once, ideally twice. Although it's easier for this particular section to read through it once for understanding, and then kind of focus in on rereading certain sections so that you can figure out the grammaticality and figure out like the flow of ideas and the connections between for the overall writing and editing portion of this section. Okay. Again, annotation, same concepts from reading test apply. So doing things like circling proper nouns and numbers, especially circling like the boxes, at least in the passages on this, like I showed you earlier. We went through this list already, and we have this kind of long, massive list of different kinds of concepts for the writing test for grammar. Okay, that we'll kind of go into. But this is for your reference so that you can kind of look at these lists of grammar concepts or technique type questions and ask me questions. So that all kind of being said, before we switch gears to math, and we'll take another quick little break in a bit. But I do want to look at questions you had specifically on the reading test or writing and language test for practice test 1. Okay. So here's practice test 1. Questions from the first 10 questions or the first passage or any passage on this test. You can let me know in the chat. I mean, if you want to talk about specific questions from the writing and language test or the reading test. Let's try to do the reading test first, and then we'll tackle the writing and language test. And then we'll move on to math after we take a quick break. Okay? So everyone should be looking in your own practice test or on your answer sheet to decide which questions you want to ask about, because now is your time to ask about the reading test and the writing and language test for practice test 1. We'll get to the math in a bit. No one has any questions on the reading test or the writing and language test from practice test 1? You all got everything right? Or you understood specifically the questions you got wrong and why? So we don't have to review them? I mean, if that's the case, great. But I kind of doubt that's the case. Really? No questions on the reading test or the writing and language test? You all understand all those grammar concepts, and you all understand the different types of questions that were asked on the reading and language or the reading test. Really? Okay, 7 on which section? Okay, so from question 1, we'll start there. If anyone else has any other questions or specific ones you want me to look at, now is the time. Okay, and you need to put the number in there in the chat for me, because I can't hear you on this end because there are so many students in the class. I think all of you are unable to communicate other than through the chat or the Q&A for right now. Okay, so we'll do question 7 on this first passage. So question 7. Okay, so question 7 on the first passage of the reading test for practice test 1 is a main idea, usage, and function question. Okay, you can. Does that part make sense? That it's focusing on a main idea? Okay, so it's a main idea, and then it's usage and function as well, because it's asking how it's being used, how this paragraph is being used, what its function in the overall work is. Okay, so what answer choice did you give for the person who had this question? So the correct answer choice is D. The correct answer choice is D, which is analyze a reaction. Okay. Which answer choice did the person who is asking this question provide? Like, what was your choice for this one? Or did you skip it and not provide any response? B. Okay. So you said criticize a tradition. Okay. I can see where you would think that. But let's look at the first paragraph. So part of what's important about this particular type of question is that it gives you a reference place to look. So you always want to refer back to the passage. Don't just rely on what you remember about the passage, because especially when you're doing something with like the paired passages, things can blend together and you're going to be confused. Always refer back to the text. Okay, so that's step number 1. So if you weren't sure what the main purpose was, go back to the first paragraph. So our first paragraph was all the way up here. Okay, so it says, Akira came directly, breaking all tradition. Was that it? Had he followed form? Had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between? Would Chie have been more receptive? So here, our initial impression of Akira is that he's breaking tradition, and that Chie is not receptive. That's actually what we end up finding out at the end, that she's not receptive to the proposal that he makes to her daughter, in part because of the manner in which he does it, but also because of social reasons for in terms of this kind of context. So what's kind of pivotal for you to have done here is to know that Chie and her daughter Naomi are from the house of Fuji, which is a noble family in Japan. So thinking of nobility in terms of, and it's Japan in 1920. We know that you might not be aware, but Japan has the oldest continuing monarchy in existence right now. So it's still ruled by an emperor, technically, although I won't get into the logistics of the actual dynamics of the country. But when you think of nobility, you should be thinking about tradition. So, which I think is what you were doing in question 7, where you said criticize a tradition. So we need to kind of look a little deeper at what is actually happening, what the author is actually doing. So this question is asking us about not only about the main idea. So what is being criticized? Like, the author isn't technically criticizing a tradition. So that's also why that answer choice is incorrect. What the author is actually doing is analyzing a reaction. So the author is kind of retrospectively going back and saying, why why was Chie not receptive? Had Akira approached her more traditionally, had he embraced his culture, his cultural traditions more so than he did, had he been less abrupt and followed all the appropriate channels, would she have been more willing to say, okay, yeah, you're a grown up. Yeah, I can see you marrying my daughter. I will at least consider it, even though we know going into this that Chie and Naomi are both from a noble family, and Akira, we can tell, is not. Okay, that isn't part of this issue. It's not stated that he isn't, but you can tell from his behavior and his actions. So where you went wrong with this particular question is that you focused in on the fact that, like, what Akira was doing. Akira is really it looks to us as if he's criticizing the tradition because of the way that he's doing it, that he's not embracing that tradition. He's kind of rebelling against that tradition. But that's not really what's happening in this paragraph. The purpose of this paragraph is to analyze and assess the events that are actually about to transpire, okay? Or that the author is really recounting to the reader, okay, about this situation. So it's not questioning a suggestion because there wasn't a suggestion made. It's not really describing a culture because it's not specifying, it's not really stating what the cultural norms are, other than that there's usually a go-between for arranging marriages, so that the son, like the potential bride and groom, don't actually get to choose. Like we understand that. So this question involved really kind of understanding a little bit more about Japanese culture. But if we look at this particular paragraph, would Chie have been more receptive? It is asking, it's analyzing a reaction. It's analyzing Chie's reaction. So again, for anyone who needs to leave early, the video will be available most likely once the homework email is sent out, or soon or shortly thereafter. Okay. So you'll get that kind of early this week. So you have, does question 7 now make sense for the person who had the question? Okay. What other questions does anyone have on the reading test? Any more from this particular passage on any of the other passages? Yay, nay, what? Do the other questions all make sense for everyone from the reading test? So I'm going to also just kind of point out, because I don't remember if I did earlier, but I do also annotate information and look through the blurb that's provided about the infographic. So you want to kind of bear that in mind too, because it's going to give you clues about the infographic and can help you later on decide whether or not the information in here is valid, or if it is kind of contradicting what the author's saying about it, or the author's misinterpreting it. So it's helpful to do that as well. Anyone have any other questions on the reading test? If not, then we're going to move on to the writing test. Okay, so since I'm not hearing from anyone, I'm going to say that we're good on the reading test for practice test 1. And does anyone have any questions on the writing and language test for practice test 1? What specific questions do you want to look at? Or concepts that you need to kind of revisit? Again, unless you tell me, I will not know. Unfortunately, I'm not psychic. Or at least because I can't see anyone. But I'm not psychic. So it's just, you need to tell me if you have questions. So no one has any questions then on writing and language test from this week? Oh. We will be doing the math soon. So everyone understands things like parallel structure and all of that. Combining sentences, colon usage. Verb tense, all that makes sense. Yeah? Yes or no, everyone? Okay, I'm gonna assume, since I haven't heard from anyone, that yes, it's okay, we can move on. All right. If not, if we didn't get to your question, because you couldn't find it in time, or you forgot about it, then email me, please, if you still have questions on that. For the math test, we're gonna start the math test in I guess yeah, we can start it now. So first, I want to just kind of check in with everyone and make sure that you don't have any questions specifically about how to use these formulae. Everyone understands area of a circle, circumference, area of triangles, of rectangles, etc. Dealing with rectangular prisms, all of that, or spheres or cylinders, special properties of right triangles, all that makes sense. Pythagorean theorem. Yeah. Okay, then if that all makes sense for you, then you need to let me know what questions you have about the math. So we're going to start with the third math section. And again, unless you tell me that you have a question, I'm not going to be able to know which content we need to go over specifically for this test. (13) on section 3. Okay. So let's take a quick look. Okay. So what type of question do we have? Like what type of math are we kind of dealing with here? Anyone? So question 13. If x is greater than 3, which of the following is equivalent to 1 over 1 over divided by x plus 2 plus 1 divided by x plus 3. So B is ultimately the right answer here. So x squared plus 5x plus 6 over 2x plus 5. So if we kind of think about this, what we have different forms in our answers. Okay, so which answer did you provide for the person who asked this question? What was your answer choice? Okay, so you answered A. Can anyone maybe describe why A might not be the answer? You can say in the chat for everyone. So can anyone explain why A isn't the right answer? Like what is it about A that should have been incorrect? So clearly there's an error here with solving this equation and identifying what you needed to do with it. So it's a complex question, at least at first glance, right? So it's looking like you're dealing with fractions, right? So fractions are going to be messy. You're also dealing with variables. So you're dealing with fractions with variables, which makes it even more messy. Okay. But question 13, B is the best answer choice. So we basically have to rewrite 1 over everything on the bottom, the denominator, which I'm not going to read again, but multiplying it by actually, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it that way. So I might actually want to write this out on the whiteboard, an actual whiteboard, and keep that question up. All right. Did anyone else get this question wrong? Kind of going through. So bear with me while I actually write it out on here for you for how to solve it. So you're kind of dealing with having to rework this problem. So you start with 1 over 1 divided by x plus 2. And I'll show everyone what I'm working on for the solution in just a second. Okay, so you basically want to then multiply by, you're multiplying by x plus 2. And x plus 3. So you're basically, why do you think we might be multiplying by x over 2, x plus 2 multiplied by x plus 3 over x plus 2 over x plus 3? What's the reason we might be doing that? Okay, so someone else maybe did get this question wrong. Anyone? So looking at this problem, we want to simplify this in a way, right? We want to basically be able to get an equivalent to the expression in choice B, right? So we want to be able to figure out how to do that. And the best way to do that is by multiplying that expression that we're given by x plus 2 over by this complicated thing, which I'm going to show you here. Okay, so it's going to be, you're basically taking x plus 2, x plus 3 over x plus 2, x plus 3, which would be the equivalent of what? What is this value? 1, right? Okay, so it's the equivalent of 1. Why do we do that? Sorry, losing my whiteboard here. So it's going to result ultimately in the expression x plus 2 times x plus 3 over x plus 2 plus x plus 3. Okay, so ultimately it's going to give us this expression after multiplying by 1. So multiplying this by 1 is going to give us x plus 2. Sorry, I didn't end my parentheses. X plus 2 times x plus 3 over x plus 2 plus x plus 3. Are you with me so far? Or did I lose anyone? Okay, so basically, once I do that, this is an equivalent. This is the same thing. We can rewrite this. Remember our kind of properties of multiplication, of like dealing with things like the commutative property of multiplication. You're dealing with also like distributive property. All of those different types of properties are showing us, meaning that we can rewrite this as x squared, because again, you're multiplying this x squared value here. So this is how we're getting x squared, right? And we're getting plus 5x. Okay, so we're doing, again, we're going to be dealing with this 2 also being multiplied here. Okay, so remember kind of our properties of multiplication. So we end up with 5x. And then we are kind of dealing with plus 6. Okay, over the same thing where we have 2x, because remember when we're adding things in parentheses here, we're kind of ending up with 2x plus, so again, we're kind of distributing our numbers here. So 2x plus 5. Okay, so you're kind of combining these together. Does that make sense to everyone? So then you're ending up with this expression. So it's a different way to convey this information. You can use this, it means the same thing ultimately. You're just using you're using a property of multiplication and addition to and division to be able to rewrite that. Okay, so think about like here you were converting, you needed to multiply this by 1, right? Because you need it to be able to get kind of a coefficient. Remember, the coefficient of this would be 1, right? That it would have of this expression. You need it to be able to get this so that you're no longer dealing with this big number in this kind of big equation on its own like that. You needed to be able to rephrase it in a way so that you could get a more concrete answer. Okay, so you didn't have like fractions underneath a fraction, those types of things. Okay, so you needed to kind of multiply it by a reciprocal to be able to get it, so you could flip it, so you could basically end up with a more easy to follow answer. Okay, so you're kind of dealing with that. Did 13 kind of make more sense then? So basically, A A, C, and D are incorrect and can result in kind of common algebraic errors. So you have to think about what it is that you're doing and what this original equation represents, how we can maybe simplify it so that it's easier for us to follow. And then how we do that is using, and what we do with what this actually means, that there are different ways to write the same information, especially in dealing with multiplication and when we're dealing with things like multiplication of and properties of multiplication or addition, or dealing with like division and subtraction. So these are just kind of basic algebraic equations, to like properties that were apply, or mathematical concepts that we're applying to algebraic expressions or equations. Does that make sense? So that you can get a different form for an answer. So B is the only equivalent form that's available. Everything else results in kind of a mathematical error of some sort when you're dealing with this kind of complex fraction. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone else have a question on the math section? Sorry, that was a kind of convoluted answer. But it was a complex fractions are tricky, and usually you can rework them so that they are in an easier form, and that's what you should really do. And think about how math has many different ways to express the same concept or to put things in a different form, and depending on what you need it for. What other questions do people have on the math section? Anything on question 3? So someone has question on 1 on question for the passage 3, or section 3, I'm sorry. So question 1. So question 1, again, we're dealing with algebra. Okay, so they're asking you to solve. So if x minus 1 over 3 equals k and k equals 3, what is the value of x? So they're just asking you here to solve for, to basically solve for the value of x. So they're giving you a value for k. So what we can do for that is really just kind of think about that. We know that k equals 3. You just have to kind of think that, oh, they're giving you an equation. They're giving you information. So you have x minus 1 over 3 equals k. So you're starting with this, x minus 1 over 3 equals k, but they're giving you the value of k, which is 3. Okay, so that's information, extra information they're giving you to help you solve the equation, so that you only have one variable that you're dealing with, so that you can then find the value of x. So basically what you would do in that case, you're kind of dealing with, you want to substitute that in. So you have x minus 1 over 3 equals 3. Okay, so that's your next step. From there, you generally want to be able to kind of multiply both sides of your equation, right? So it's going, and why are we multiplying by both sides? Anyone have any idea? Someone can ask or let me know in the chat if you do. So if you kind of rewrite it as x minus 1 over 3 equals 3, and you're multiplying it by 3. Okay. So you basically are multiplying each side of this equation by 3 because you want to cancel out the 3 that's in the denominator down here. Okay, so you want to ultimately get x by itself to solve this equation. So what you have to do is multiply by 3 so that you can then get your answer. So you end up with x minus 1 over 1 equals 9. So ultimately you're kind of going and you want to be able to reduce it. So the 3's cancel out on this side, giving you a fraction over 1, which any fraction over 1 is going to be that number. So x minus 1 is here. And then you solve for x. And to do that, you need to do x minus 1 plus 1 equals 9 plus 1, right? Because the reason you need to do that is because you're trying to get x by itself. So ultimately the 1's cancel out on this side, which I'm not going to show you just because of space, but basically x equals 10. So that's why D is the right answer. Does that make sense for everyone? So this is a more simplistic algebraic equation, whereas the one that for 13 is more complex because it's dealing with complex fractions, whereas this is a more simplistic equation that requires you to solve for x and plug in numbers that they give you. Okay, so you probably made an error in your calculations. And I apologize if everyone can hear my cat, who is again meowing and interrupting. She apparently just has to make an appearance all the time. Does that make sense for the person who had a question about it? Yes, no? Anyone have any other questions on that? $19. So 19 on section 3. Okay, so 19, remember you're dealing with right triangles. Okay, and we have a formula at the very beginning that is giving us information pertaining to right triangles, which could be appropriate here, but we need to kind of remember that we're dealing here with trigonometry, like trigonoanalysis. So they're asking us in this question to kind of figure out what the cosine of 90 degrees minus x degrees is. Okay, where x degrees equals, where the sine of x degrees is 4 over 5, or 4/5. Okay. So we know that one angle of a right triangle is x degrees. Okay, so we can actually look back to our kind of information that they give us, and maybe something might click here for you. So if we're dealing with right triangles, right? So you want to know, we know that 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90. We know that we're dealing with a right triangle. So we know that it's most likely we have 45 degrees, 45 degrees, we have 60 degrees, we have 30 degrees. We have to figure out, we have those kinds of that kind of information. We know that the sum of the measures in degrees of the angles of a triangle is 180. So those are things that we have to kind of work with to kind of get us thinking about triangles and thinking about what maybe we might need to know when we're solving an equation like this. So if we look at 19, they're really kind of saying, I mean, 4/5 or 0.8 is the right answer here, ultimately. And this requires kind of, it's because of the kind of complementary angle relationship for sine and cosine. So it requires understanding those concepts in trigonometry or trigonoanalysis, and to kind of understand that the sine of x degrees equals the cosine of 90 degrees minus x degrees. Therefore, the cosine of 90 degrees minus x degrees has to be 4/5. Okay, so either the fraction 4/5 or its decimal equivalent of 0.8 can be gridded as the correct answer. So you can also, if trig analysis is too complex of a way to solve this question, you can also solve it by constructing a right triangle. So you could do something. So if trying to plug that into your calculator, you're not really experienced enough with trig analysis, because you can solve this a different way. And that's true for any of the questions on the math section, especially when they seem to be wanting you to do more complex math. Chances are there's a simpler way to solve it that will get you the right answer, that doesn't require you to solve it using complex math. So trig analysis would qualify more as kind of more on the complex side of math. So if you're not sure how to solve it as that, you can think about what you know about right triangles. So if we know that if we have kind of a right triangle, I'll kind of do like a rudimentary kind of drawing here for you. Okay, so if we kind of start like this, so we have this kind of box is representing 90 degrees, as I think all of you know. That means that one of these angles, this one is 90 degrees minus X degrees in terms of the measurement of this angle. Another, the other angle here that's not 90 degrees is X degrees. Okay, so basically, since two of the angles of the triangle are of a measure X and 90 degrees, the third angle has to have the measure of 180 degrees. So remember me reading through that information about from the front of section 3 about properties of right triangles and information regarding the angle, the measurement. I'll just go back to it. So looking at properties of special right triangles, as well as looking at the sum of the measures and degrees of the angles of a triangle is 180. Okay, you remember that? So if we're dealing with question 19 and we're not solving it using trigonometry, we know that 180 degrees minus 90 degrees is going to equal, or minus X degrees is going to equal 90 degrees minus X. Okay, so we know that the two of the angles of the triangle are of a measure of X degrees and 90 degrees. So we know that X degrees and 90 degrees. Okay, because we know that, that means that the third angle has to have that measure of 90 degrees minus X. Okay, so 180 degrees minus 90 degrees minus X equals 90 degrees minus X. Okay, so it's whatever that value is. So from the figure, the cosine of 90 degrees minus X, which is equal to the ratio of the length of the side adjacent to the angle measuring 90 degrees minus X to the hypotenuse, which is here, the 5, okay, is also 4/5. So that means that one of its sides is going to be 4. The hypotenuse is going to be 5. So we have a 4-5, we have a right triangle here. We have a 4-5 right triangle. So that basically means that that 90 minus X is going to have to be the right answer. I mean, so that 4/5 is going to have to be the right answer, because we're dealing with a ratio 4/5, right? Does that make sense? So you're basically dealing with, we know that that 4 to that 5 is going to have to be That's the ratio that we're dealing with. And that's actually the value of the cosine of 90 degrees minus x, because we know that when we're dealing with complementary angle relationship for sine and cosine. Okay. So you can kind of you can construct the right triangle that has an angle of measure x such that the sine of x degrees equals 4/5. Okay. So basically that means where sine of x is equal to the ratio of the length of the side opposite the angle measuring x degrees. So x degrees is here. So that means that the 4 is the value for this side, and because the hypotenuse would be the longest side, right? So basically then the ratio of the length of the side opposite the angle measuring x degrees to the length of the hypotenuse, or 4/5, so 4 to 5. Okay, so that's the ratio. And since two of the angles of the triangle are measure x and 90 minus x, that means the third angle has to be 180 minus 90 minus x, which equals 90 minus x. So that means that that's equal to the ratio of the length of the side adjacent to the angle measuring 90 minus x here. Okay. And then that means that the side adjacent to the angle measuring 90 minus x to the hypotenuse is also 4 to 5. It's also a 4 to 5 ratio. Okay, so that means that this is the side that's 4 and this is the side that's 5. So therefore, the only possible answer choice is that we're dealing with cosine of 90 minus x degrees is going to equal 4/5. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So what I would actually think you should do is look through the math videos and kind of revisit what sine and cosine are and their relationship to one another. So when you're dealing with those kind of trigonometric functions, or you're dealing with kind of the relationship between angles and degrees, and especially properties of triangles, you want to kind of revisit those. So that's kind of my recommendation, because we don't have time to be able to go through and kind of break down every aspect of that particular question. That was a good question though. So anyone have any other ones? And the same thing for the other two questions. So any of the concepts that are still kind of unclear, that's what you want to use your time to kind of focus on, like kind of go question by question and breaking down what it is you got wrong. You should be doing this anyway when you're going through and scoring, self-scoring, and then looking through your answers and identifying what you got wrong and why. So I'm expecting for everyone to going forward to be able to identify whether or not you're getting a concept wrong, or if you're making simply a calculation error or a careless reading error. You should be doing that for every section of this test. So that should be just part of your regimen every week. So once you've actually gone through and done your practice test and done the self-scoring, you want to then take that a step further by looking at each individual question that you got wrong, and not only reviewing the answer choices, though the answers and explanations for the questions, which are provided, I believe, every week, should be included with the information, or they're available with easy access online on the College Board's website for you. I gave you links to in our kind of notes from last week. You want to make sure that you're not only reading through the answers that they provide, but that you are trying to figure out where you went wrong, why you went wrong, and how to fix it, so that you can then get those questions right going forward. And if it's a question of content that you don't quite understand a concept, and you find that it's essentially a consistent pattern, you need to let me know so that we can spend time going through it, or you can email me privately and let me know that you need additional resources for something, so that we can kind of help you get through that, so you do ultimately get more questions right than you get wrong, or that you can get questions right that you thought you weren't going to be able to because you did this extra work. Okay, so this is part of your weekly practice. I know it seems like it's a lot, but this isn't an ordinary test. This is a test that requires you, I mean, you should be doing this anyway when you get tests back in school, but I know students generally don't do this, and figuring out what it is you got wrong and why you went wrong. Although that's true on the math tests in particular, that you generally do have to figure out what you did wrong and solve it correctly. So if you are having trouble in terms of like trying to graph things on your calculator, that you're making sure you're familiar with the particular version of the calculator that you have and the steps for solving, for plugging in those types of equations specific to your calculator, because not everyone is going to have the exact same calculator. But I mean, I can help you troubleshoot things as much as possible, but for those kind of technical things, you do need to be familiar enough with your own calculator to be able to use it when you need it. Okay, so does that all kind of make sense? So question 19, in a right triangle, one angle measures X degrees. So we were dealing with angles, we were dealing with trigonometric functions, we were dealing with kind of ratios, and fractions. So you kind of want to revisit all those types of concepts if some aspect of that is not, if you don't remember what they are. And remember that all fractions are a ratio in some way, or like the kind of basic concepts that from like middle school level math, roughly, for most of you, that were covered at that point that you might not remember. So again, the same thing with all of our multiplication properties from that question on, what was it, question 13. Those are kinds of things that you need to revisit. You need to make sure you're familiar with all those kinds of properties and rules and different things like that, because chances are you're going to have a question on it kind of going forward. Okay, so you want to be familiar with that. You want to be familiar with things like angles, and know what a line segment is, know what an arc is, know those things, so that you can put yourself in a position that you have the most chance for success. And a lot of the math test success comes from being able to understand what the question's asking you as quickly as possible, and being able to say, okay, how can I solve this as swiftly as I can and efficiently as I can to get me the right answer? They might be asking me to do math at one level, like the trigonometric question, but I can also use information that I know if I'm not as familiar with trigonometry, or I'm not as comfortable with that, to be able to solve it in a different way, and how I might do that. Okay. So definitely doing things like revisiting these pages, like the formula pages and the information, reading all the information that they give you when they give it to you, is helpful. Does that all make sense for everyone? So, I mean, this part of this week is you're going to be reading the about section for the math. So you're going to be reading more about the types of questions that you're going to be seeing. You're going to be going through the like dealing with the heart of algebra type of questions. You're dealing with the kind of specific examples that they had. So just to kind of reiterate. So if you're wondering where the readings and everything will be, they're in the email I sent you last week. Okay. So you can use that to kind of look at, like, this was from last week. You want to be able to look at the different chapter readings here. So you, for this week, are assigned chapters 5, which is about the SAT reading test. So that's the information that's going to give you the SAT test maker's summary of what the reading test is about and the content that you'll see on it. Chapter 6 is dealing with one of those key areas we discussed, that they kind of, the categories that they subscribe to the different types of questions that they deal with. And now you'll have a better idea of what it is that they're actually asking you to do because of our kind of coding system for it, that you can understand the specific types of questions that might fall into this category, compared to what they're saying. So that's 5 and 6 that you're doing this week. You're also going to be reading chapter 10, which is about the SAT writing and language test. And you're also reading about the SAT math test. So these are important chapters because they provide kind of key content areas. So more along the lines of what we've been discussing in our kind of introduction to each of these sections and types of questions you'll see, they're important things for you to review as part of your test preparation. So again, the kind of about the math section, algebra is a huge part of this test, and dealing with like arithmetic type of applications of algebra, like in algebraic expressions using variables and different things like that, is a key element of this exam. You're going to see a lot of that. You're going to see less things like trigon analysis type questions. You're going to see, or even kind of borderline calculus type questions. So you're going to see those as trickier questions. What you should have done for those questions, if you weren't sure how to solve them or what they were asking, was try to make it an educated guess. So try to narrow down your answer choices using process of elimination. If you tried to solve it and weren't sure and something just wasn't entirely, didn't quite feel right to you, or you really just weren't entirely confident in your answer, that's fine. I mean, you can make an educated guess and try to narrow down your choices or your potential for getting the answer right. That's the proper test taking strategy and what you want to take away from that. Not so much the fact that you were struggling with this particular type of question. That's something for your practice going forward that you can kind of isolate and work on improving over doing practice, doing more kind of revision really of your knowledge of these math skills, okay, or these reading skills or these writing and language skills, all of that you want to be going back and kind of reevaluating what it is that you're doing, so that you can ultimately like achieve your goals really. So you want to be thinking about what kinds of math are my tricky areas, what kinds of grammar questions are my tricky areas, what kinds of reading passages are or content is my tricky type of question. So those things you should be thinking about as you're going through and doing your practice. But remember, again, that in terms of the content for the math, it is mostly algebra. You're also dealing with problem solving and data analysis. You're dealing with some advanced math concepts like trigon analysis, but a lot of it is going to be geometry. A lot of it's going to be algebra or arithmetic. So you can choose which math problems you solve. And if you find that a question you blank on in terms of how to approach it, take a guess and move on. The key is not to dwell on a particular question. The key is to get you through to answering other questions so you can finish the test. Does that all make sense to everyone? Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. So this week, again, like I said, kind of your homework is practice test 10. Okay. You still want to be reviewing those math videos, reviewing the resources that are available to you, combing through even like your math textbook for school, like or resources, and seeing if there's any concepts that you need to brush up on that you don't quite remember, or looking for like on the Kaplan, the College Board's website, where they have a list of different kind of math skills that you can go through, or practice problems that you can go through to get some additional practice in addition to your practice test. So the practice test is your priority. The reading is going to be helpful for you in the long run. And then again, vocabulary study is optional, but you need to tell me if you are interested in the vocab, and you need to email me so I can give you instructions to access that. And everyone should be self-scoring and then kind of analyzing your answers as you go through like the answer and explanations, and as you kind of assess your own strategy so that you can figure out what needs to change, why it might need to change, or how we can change it, so we can make your strategy the best for you overall. Does that make sense to everyone? I'll also try to provide additional examples, because I don't think that that was a very good example of a complex fraction question. And also try to integrate some additional review of trigonometry and just kind of the basic review of those different principles. But everyone should be doing that in their practice anyway, every week, as part of your preparation for your exam. Okay, so I will try to create to focus our sessions in the future on covering some of those concepts to just kind of refresh everyone's memory. But it is helpful because there are so many of you. The chances are we're not going to be able to get to everyone's specific questions unless you tell me. Okay, so everyone should know what your homework is this week, but the homework email will be going out later this week. Did anyone have any additional questions, last minute questions on the practice test from this week? So practice test 1. I mean, kind of looking at our annotations, we didn't really look at anything from 4. I mean, we only have a few minutes left for today. So, I mean, I think everyone should also be looking at kind of revisiting what's a reciprocal, what's an imaginary number, what does a square root actually mean? Like those types of things. What is mean, average, and range? Like all of those kinds of keywords and concepts that you might have used in an earlier level math, but you might not have thought of them for a while, that you need to revisit because they're going to be on this test in most cases. You also want to pay attention to any charts that they give you for answering particular types of questions, or any formula they give you to answer additional questions, like from last week. I think there was one that we were looking at briefly last week. Understanding what a parabola is, like all of these, what the different quadrants are and what they mean in terms of dealing with XY planes. All of those types of things are things that you want to start really thinking about and familiarizing yourself with again for this test, because they're going to throw things that you haven't seen in years at you. like the distributive property or different things like that, or what factoring is, or different things like that. You want to be as familiar with these concepts as possible so that you have your own study sheet of custom formulas that you need to work on and revisit, that are not necessarily the ones that they provide for you in particular. So they might be things that you do need to memorize going forward, or work on knowing well enough that you can remember. Does that all make sense? So we do have different, someone did just ask a quick question, which is off topic, but does anyone have any questions that are on? I'll address that question in just a second, but does anyone have any questions regarding the content we covered today, regarding the practice test? Any questions? Make note of any questions that you didn't get to ask, and hopefully if there's time next week, we can kind of cover it. But the homework again will be sent out and we can kind of get started from there. If not, regardless, I will see everyone then next week at 9. Again, thank you for everyone who is here promptly. Please try to be prompt again in the future so we can start exactly at 9 and go until 12. And for anyone who is late, you will receive a copy of the video, or it'll be posted to YouTube relatively soon in the next, as soon as shortly after the homework email comes out. But you'll be notified of that. Any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see everyone next week. For the person who did have the off-topic question, we offer this kind of course to locations all over the place, so including in New Jersey. So they can just reach out to us and we can address it there if they're interested in doing something like this. Okay. But there are probably courses already in place. So Embrace is the one to contact, not me particularly. But you should have that they should be able to find that information from our website, or contact our staff. Okay. So great job, everyone. I will see you all next week. Not a problem at all. I'll talk to you later. See everyone. Bye.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.